Hello, so you want to learn about Indo-European mythology? Well, I'm going to take you through the 4 stages of doing that in this video. First, I'll explain why you need to consider certain books. Then I'll explain the books you require to learn the mythology, the books you require to learn about the Indo-Europeans, and the books you need to learn about the study of Indo-European mythology. So I hope that all makes sense, and if that is exactly what you're looking for, then this is exactly the video you want to watch. So grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Crawford. Before I recommend some books, first I want to explain why it is important to choose certain types of books. You see, if you study a particular culture's mythology, let's say Roman mythology or Greek mythology, you would probably want to learn the Latin language so you can understand the source material. And if you wanted to learn the Nordic mythology, you would want to learn Old Norse language to be able to read the source material. But if you're studying Indo-European mythology covering many cultures, then you can either learn 15 or 20 different languages, or you buy books that are translated by a number of different people, and then you can aggregate the words from those books to try and give you a good view of what the translation of the material actually means. And the reason you want to do this is that most of the source material for Indo-European mythology isn't in English, and I'll assume many of you are English speakers natively, and that means that when you buy a book, you're buying a translation, and the academic who translated that book has either translated it figuratively to try and capture the meaning of the translation, or literally to explain what the words actually mean on a word-by-word basis. And this means you get different types of translation. And then what further complicates the situation is that many of the myths are in a poetic form, and so some translators try and maintain that poetic form, so when you read it, it feels like the poetry, but some translators again make it literal, so you actually get a sense of what the words actually meant, but then there's a balance of being figurative as well in that. So that is why you have to be quite careful on what books you choose, and whilst in some instances I'll recommend multiple books to do this. The other thing you need to understand is how to get hold of these books. Now, some of them will be available in ebook format, and for many people researching, I do recommend that format because it allows you to search the text quickly and easily. But if you wanted to buy the book, I would often suggest that Amazon isn't the best place to start. eBay is quite good for second-hand books because many of these books will be old, and also a company called Edda Books I use quite a lot, as they tend to be a good source for second-hand books. And with that, let me begin by recommending some books on the various mythologies in the Indo-European landscape. So first off, we're going to go to Scandinavia and the Nordic myths, so Odin and Thor and Frigg and Freyr. And with that, I'll recommend the Prose Edda. This is a book written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian scholar. However, whilst this book is relatively easy to read and will give you a good insight to the gods and the mythology in Scandinavia and Iceland, there are stories in here that have been made up by Snorri Sturluson that aren't original myth. And there's good academic consensus around these stories, such as Utgard Loki, which is more of a Christian conversion tool rather than a historical record of myth. And this book wasn't really meant to be a historical record of myth, more of a book about understanding the poetry of the Nordic people. So, good book to get. The Faulkes translation by Everyday is my recommendation. There are other versions out there, but none of them really match the quality of this. Now, if you wanted to go slightly deeper into it, then what you need to know about the Prose Edda is that it isn't actually a single Old Norse document that has been translated. There are a number of versions of the Prose Edda from various areas, and these have been aggregated and collated. So Faulkes wrote this, actually looked at other versions, and one of the ones he looked at is the Upsala Edda. So you can actually get a book called the Upsala Edda, which is a translation of that Old Norse document, which he used to help create this book. And this may contain a few differences to this. And again, when I talk about looking at various books for different translations and further meaning, this is also good to have in your bookshelf if Nordic mythology is your thing. Now, alongside the Prose Edda, people would have heard of the Poetic Edda. I would recommend reading the Prose Edda, then the Poetic Edda, and then probably go back and read the Prose Edda again, and then the Poetic Edda again, because that gives you a really good understanding of the background of the myths, some of the myths. Then if you read the background again, they may make more sense, more coherent, and then if you read the Poetic Edda again once more, you'll understand more, get to see more. Now, the recommended version I always suggest to people is Carolyne Larrington's version. She's a professor at Oxford, and she's written supporting works such as Handbook on Eddic poetry alongside this, but she's written other texts as well. These are good not only because she puts the poems in context, but she also explains some of the more difficult translation decisions in there, which you find that other authors don't do. Now, if you look at other Eddas, and it's really worth looking at other Poetic Eddas, as I say, to get a good understanding of what's going on. Hollander and Crawford are two, for example. They all have their pros and cons. Crawford is very, I'd say, family friendly, and after the third print version, I think all these print mistakes had gone. So this is an easy read, but if you want to actually really understand the translations of the study, probably wouldn't be my first choice. Hollander is, again, very good translation, but Larrington, I'd say, it would be the first choice if you could only buy one. And if you could afford more books, as I say, she does do supporting work, which is well worth it. So they're the books to understand Nordic mythology. The books of Greece I'd recommend reading to understand mythology are three, and they are the Illiad, the Odyssey, and Metamorphoses. Now, Homer wrote the Iliad and Odyssey. Not that Homer was a real person, probably wasn't. And what I would say is, unless you're actually doing a real academic study in these books, then just buy a version that you feel comfortable with reading in terms of its size and in terms of how the text is presented. The Penguin versions are very good. I've actually bought them in a nice, colourful binding so they look a bit prettier on the shelves. But yeah, and they last a bit longer because the paperback version just falls apart after about 20 reads. But they're the versions I've got. But I also did this because they had Ovid's Metamorphoses in here too. As I say, just choose, these are big books, so just choose a version you think reads best. What's good about Metamorphoses is that it really covers much of the mythology of Greece, although it's at a point in time, which is why it's worth reading other Greek mythology books. So that's my second choice on Greece. And if you read that alongside the Nordic mythologies, you actually start seeing similarities about certain things happening, certain traits, cattle raiding, dragon slaying, Lysa, berserker type things. And so with those, there's two other mythological books I would suggest you read, although some may not consider them mythology, and that is the Rig Veda and the Zend-Avesta. So the Rig Veda is the Vedic book from India, the oldest religious text we have. Again, isn't something I would expect anyone to read cover to cover, and instead I'd expect people to just pull out verses and hymns as and when you need them. There are cheap versions like this, which are about £30, which are good if you wanted a hard copy. Max Muller's done a few in his Sacred Eastern texts, but there is an actually far better translation, more recent. That's about £350, £400. And I'll link all these in the YouTube description below, which you'll see as you click the like button, which will be grateful. Again, Rig Veda and the Zend-Avesta are, and again, and even the Odyssey and Illiad, these are books that buy ebook versions because it's so much easier if you need to find a particular hymn or a particular subject, such as text about Indra or Vitra, then it's easy just to do a search. And again, with the Zend-Avesta, there's all sorts of translations. Here we've got Domestita as well as Max Muller ones. These are sort of prints of old translations. You can get more modern ones, but you do spend a few £100 getting those. Also, although I'm going slightly off topic, Mary Boyce has written some great books on Zoroastrianism as well and its history. So between those, Nordic, Greek, Iranian or Persian and Indic and the Vedic cultures, you get a really good sense of mythology, and you will start seeing similarities between all these, and that's your first hints at Indo-European mythology. So let's try and look at some other books that help sort of glue this together and provide additional information. So I'm going to concentrate in Europe for these, and the first book I'd recommend is The Tane by Kieran Carson's translation in Penguin. I've read this a lot. It's a great book. It may not on first sight seem like it's linked to Indo-European mythology, but when you get to the end, you'll certainly realise it is, with the analogues of how the cattle are used to create the landscape. And Kuhl himself is the name of a wolf, and actually has some connection with Lysa, the berserker form. So there are the roots in there. Well worth reading as a sort of an additional piece of text. The other book is Sienna Davis's Mabinogion, certainly a Celtic-influenced mythology, influences from Wales and Ireland, touches with King Arthur and the like. Absolutely beautiful story. If you ever get a chance to see it performed, do it. Really good. Read that alongside The Tane. It's just, this is mythology at its best in terms of Indo-European mythology. I love these stories. So those interested in Nordic mythology, then you have Beowulf. There's Seamus Hennis's version. I have another version here which is dual language, and I've got Lee Azza's translation here. And the reason why I've got so many is just because of how it's translated and interpreted. I find is probably the most poetic, tries to maintain all the alliteration you have in the original poem. Dual language is good if you want to try and understand Old English more, but there's also another version of the book which I've recommended in previous videos, which is Beowulf and its analogues. So it's got a great translation, but equally at the back it's got chapters about the characters within Beowulf and where they appear in other literature. So again, if you're studying mythology in Indo-European mythology, that's a really useful tool to have. So again, this is the sort of book you can't buy, probably wouldn't be able to buy on Amazon. You really have to search secondhand bookshops such as Books and eBay. Recommended. So I want to give an honourable mention to the Kalevala, which isn't really an Indo-European book, but it's a great piece of mythology, an epic poem from Finland. And again, something worth having if you wanted to build up a little book collection, a great mythology for Europe, worth doing as well. And by the way, this is an Oxford World Classics, a number of books, Oxford World Classics. They're pretty good translations on a whole. So, recommended. Now you have all those mythological books, so you can understand the myths themselves, and by reading all those you will absolutely see links between the stories and understand that actually they must all originate from similar sources or the same source. Then how do we go about understanding this more and understanding the Indo-Europeans more? So these next books are to help you understand that part of the study. So first off, I would recommend, if you're going to buy one book about Indo-European mythology, covering everything, Jan Prouvel's Comparative Mythology. Now, Jan, I believe, studied briefly under Dumézil as well as others. It's a great book, worth a read. Do not skip the introduction. It's really good. It touches on some of the earlier mythology from the Near East, especially around the creation myth and how that happened. But then he talks about the various cultures and the mythology of those cultures, and it's good. So it doesn't compare sort of gods across all cultures. It just looks at a culture and what's going on in there. So you have to read the whole book to understand the similarities across the Indo-European landscape. But really highly recommended. This may be available on places like Amazon, but if not, secondhand bookshop. Really good, quite cheap as well, relatively. So next, if you want to understand the language a little more as well as the culture, then Falsten's book, The Indo-European Language and Culture, is recommended. It's quite a modern publication. It's on the second edition now, I think. Again, well worth getting if you want to study the language a little bit more as well as the culture. If you want to, another book similar to this, but it's probably more popular, is Mallory and Adams' book on the introduction to Proto-Indo-European and the Indo-European world. Touches on culture, touches on language. Again, alongside those two books, the last one of this together, give you a great reference material. Now, both of those I do believe are again in ebook format, and so if you're studying, that may be a way you prefer to go rather than having the hard copies. There's two other books on this list. One is the infamous Horse, the Will and Language by David Anthony. Absolutely great book, concentrates primarily on archaeological evidence to show where the Indo-Europeans came from. He does have a reconstruction of the Indo-European creation myth, I think in chapter 8, in which he leverages Bruce Lincoln's work, and Bruce Lincoln was a student of Mircea Eliade, who's another very famous mythologist, as is Bruce Lincoln. So really good book, really easy to read, although it's a lot of information. There are a lot of diagrams and maps, so if you're an audiobook fan, you really would need to ensure you get the PDFs, because there must be PDFs for this showing the maps and archaeology. Otherwise, some of it may be lost on you. Really good book, highly recommended, as I say, and just helps you to understand some of the cultural behaviours through archaeological finds that the Indo-Europeans had, from sacrifices to using the horse, using the wheel. In fact, at the end of the day, you will feel like you could understand horse archaeology just by looking at horse teeth quite well, just by reading this. It goes into it in a lot of detail. Very good book. And the final book is on poetry, and it's How to Kill a Dragon. Very good book. Touches on a number of themes and talks about Indo-European poetry and the stories within it, including the Dragon Slayer myth. This is by Calvert Watkins, and there isn't really much more to say other than, if you're going to get a book that isn't a myth book and isn't a generic Indo-European book, such as the few I've just mentioned, this would be a really good one to get. Certainly if you want to understand the mythology more and you're really interested in the poetry, because it oozes the culture of the Indo-Europeans. So let's get into the real meaty books next. So with these books, what I've tried to do is to create a decent mix of authors and quality of work. First off, we have Bruce Lincoln, who I've just mentioned earlier, who has written two great books. Well, he's written loads of books, but these two I would constantly recommend: Death, War and Sacrifice and Myth, Cosmos and Society. So Death, War and Sacrifice talks about particular motifs within the Indo-Europeans, touches on the dogs of the underworld, touches on people like the ferryman of the dead, but it touches on other aspects of the cattle raiding myth and the like. Very good book. He's actually, I don't know if he's written a book on, I think it was Lincoln who wrote a book on cattle raiding. Yes, he did. Sorry, having a quick check up there. I've got it there. So very good book, pretty easy to read. And it's when you start using these books that you really start to need to understand the citations they use and the books they use. So if you're studying mythology and you see a chapter in here of things you want to read, he'll have a lot of references. Make sure you check out those books if you really want to understand what he's talking about, where he got his source information from. Otherwise, you can make mistakes in assertions. So it is quite useful. Most books with post-it notes in our books I use on a regular basis. Thing here, Myth, Cosmos and Society. It's more about the cosmogony and the etiology of Indo-European culture. Really good to understand the cycle of life. And there's other little tales in there as well about medicine and food and the like. So, very good book. This used to be really expensive. I think it's a bit cheaper now. And I think I had to pay $120 for this copy, but I have seen it now for about $40. So, shop around. Get that. Certainly, if you're interested in the religious aspects of the Indo-Europeans and certainly the European side of those aspects, and this is a really good book for you. It'll tell you things that just aren't in like Germanic and Nordic texts. So, highly recommended. Next, in terms of creating a broad scope of books to read, Myth in Indo-European Antiquity. So this book I like. It's from Larson, but it's also got Scott Littleton and Jan Privel input into it. Jan did the comparative mythology. Scott Littleton's well known for his folklore work. This covers a whole heap of essays on the subject. Again, it's worth getting. A great book just to give you a real good understanding across the board of Indo-European mythology. And it touches on Dumasil, on ritual, on lesser known gods. Again, so highly recommended, have that in your bookshelf. Next, Casapo's Theories of Mythology. Here, this really covers so many aspects of mythology, not just Indo-European mythology, world mythology. And if you've got to this point, this is really interesting to know, because the world didn't start with the Indo-Europeans. The Indo-Europeans basically were a bunch of male warriors from the Black Sea region, and when they spread out, it was young men who spread out without their families, because it's a patriarchal society, and the eldest son managed to inherit his father's land when the father died, but the younger sons then had to go off and breed with whatever women they met, which would tend to be in Europe, the Neolithic farmers and the Western hunter-gatherers. So, and those people have different sources of information. So the Neolithic myths probably influenced the Indo-European myths that then merged with the Neolithic myths again. So Wellworth covers lots of different subjects, and not just subjects, but different methods of studying mythology. So that's, again, a really good book if you want to expand where you're going with mythological studies. Next, we have a great general book on the essays of the history of religions. It covers all sorts of things from creation myths to how Greek mythology or religion began. But it's just to say, I'm trying to give you a number of different authors to read. If you get hold of this, again, there's some really interesting essays. You may actually be able to pick some of them up as individual papers on academic sites. The sites I'd recommend, that people talk about academia.edu because it's quite open, but most people can join it. But JSTOR, JSTOR, is another great site. If you go to university, you've probably got free access to it. If you don't, I believe it has an option to give you 15 free downloads a month, so 15 papers a month, which is pretty generous, and it has access to old copies of magazines from Folklore, the Journal of Indo-European Studies. Not all the articles, but a good number of them, so well worth it. But yeah, an interesting read to a book collection. And finally, sort of a more generic book recommended by a number of universities if you're studying mythology is Edith Hamilton's book on mythology. This covers really the key myths, the key characters. It tends to have a bit of a European focus, but again, really good. So out of all these, if you're unsure spending a lot of money on a book, this is probably the cheapest option. Not overly academic in terms of references, but again, may fill you with confidence on Indo-European mythology is what you want to study, or indeed it may influence you to look further just at Roman or Greek myths or like. So with that, I believe that is a good review. And so that concludes going over the books if you want to understand mythology and understand how to understand mythology of the Indo-European myths and cultures and traditions. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments below. I do try and read them all, and I will try to respond to as many as I can. I want to thank my patrons for their constant support, which helps me to buy some of these books, which is really generous of them. And I hope with that you will now ask me even more questions when you watch my videos to find out more information. And so please stay safe and stay well. And this was Crackenford.